In multicultural societies, a distinctive pattern frequently manifests in interactions between members of majority or historically dominant groups, particularly those of European descent, and minority or non-white outgroups. Members of the former often engage in overt displays of empathy, compassion, and moral superiority through elaborate rhetorical commitments, resource transfers, institutional concessions, and self-abnegating gestures. These acts are typically framed as efforts to affirm equality and demonstrate enlightened benevolence. From the perspective of costly signaling theory, in evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology, however, such behaviors commonly serve as mechanisms for broadcasting status, virtue, and self-perceived moral elevation rather than straightforward altruism. Costly signaling theory explains how individuals incur tangible expenses, material resources, social dignity, or group interests to credibly convey desirable traits to observers. In this context, performative benevolence functions as a costly signal. The public sacrifice of dignity or power signals the actor's commitment to prosocial norms, thereby securing reputational gains, peer admiration within elite circles, or psychological relief from perceived historical guilt complexes. Unlike low-cost rhetoric, cheap talk, these displays maintain some credibility precisely because they impose real costs on the signaler. The recipients, in turn, frequently respond with strategic accommodation. They outwardly perform acceptance of the proffered benevolence, adopting roles of grateful alignment with narratives of equality and compassion, while privately recognizing the underlying weakness and self-interest. This play-along strategy converts the signaler's need for validation into concrete advantages, financial, political, or status-based, without genuine endorsement of the giver's moral framework or reciprocity. The interaction thus devolves into a dual performance of pomposity. The dominant group actor projects fake compassion and superiority. The outgroup actor projects appreciative deference, each advancing private incentives at the expense of authenticity. This dynamic constitutes a benevolence signaling cycle, a self-reinforcing loop of mutual fraud sustained by asymmetric incentives. The signaler experiences psychic rewards of self-importance and moral distinction, often rooted in cultural, religious, or sociological pressures that valorize self-sacrifice and inclusivity as markers of enlightenment. The recipient prioritizes extraction over sincerity, viewing the exchange transactionally. Over repeated iterations, the cycle erodes the giver's dignity and collective interests while fostering underlying contempt, as private scoffing among recipients contrasts sharply with public facades. Empirical patterns in intergroup relations literature, including studies of competitive altruism and virtue signaling, support the prevalence of such mechanisms. Displays of benevolence can enhance the actor's social prestige, but invite exploitation when recipients detect the performative element. The pattern is not confined to any single demographic binary. Analogous cycles of elite patronage, clientelism, and opportunistic extraction appear across stratified societies worldwide. However, in Western contexts, the interplay is amplified by specific cultural emphases on empathy, historical guilt narratives, and status competition within professional and institutional elites, where signaling often prioritizes symbolic gestures over verifiable outcomes. Critically, framing the phenomenon through group essentialism risks oversimplification. The drivers, status seeking via moral theater, opportunism in response to perceived weakness, and hypocrisy management, are rooted in universal human adaptations for reputation management and coalition navigation. Yet when concentrated in certain subcultures, the cycle produces measurable societal costs. Inefficient resource allocation, diminished trust, and progressive forfeiture of group cohesion by the signaling majority. Scholars in evolutionary psychology, sociology of intergroup relations, and signaling theory would advance understanding by examining the personality correlates, institutional reinforcements, and long-term consequences of this moral theater. Greater attention to observable behavior, reciprocal incentives, and signal reliability, rather than scripted group narratives, offers a pathway to disrupt the cycle. Authentic cooperation, where it emerges, requires discarding theatrical benevolence in favor of pragmatic exchanges grounded in demonstrated reciprocity and preserved dignity. By analyzing performative benevolence as a predictable outcome of human signaling psychology, research can better illuminate the incentives perpetuating intergroup friction and dignity erosion in diverse settings. Conclusion: the hidden cycle of performative benevolence and strategic exploitation in modern societies. In summary, the observed dynamic represents a mutual signaling game in which segments of majority populations, particularly those of European descent, deploy performative benevolence, costly displays of empathy, compassion, and moral superiority, as a mechanism for status enhancement and self-validation, often at the expense of group dignity and resources. Minority or outgroup actors strategically accommodate these overtures through feigned acceptance and gratitude, exploiting the signaler's apparent psychological vulnerabilities to extract tangible advantages while privately scorning the underlying weakness and pomposity. This results in a self-reinforcing cycle of hypocrisy and fraud. Theatrical moral posturing on one side met with opportunistic extraction on the other, sustained by cultural incentives favoring self-abnegation and inclusivity signaling among certain elites. Ultimately, the benevolence signaling cycle constitutes a dysfunctional interplay that erodes authenticity, trust, and long-term group interests for the performing majority while delivering short-term gains to recipients. Rooted in universal human tendencies toward costly signaling and opportunism rather than any unique racial pathology, the pattern is nonetheless amplified in Western contexts by specific historical, religious, and sociological pressures. Breaking the cycle demands rejecting scripted group-based moral theater in favor of interactions grounded in observable reciprocity, individual accountability, and verifiable outcomes, thereby restoring dignity and reducing the inefficiencies of performative intergroup relations.